So this is the popular, and this is what we have grown up with. So the
Right.
question is how much we have reviewed this and rebuilt our own narrative, and how much it aligns with the reality.
Do we miss that annihilation instinct? Muhammad Ghori, he took months together to come down every time. And there were numerous occasions where he could have been killed, not the army. And if you kill the leader, you pretty much disarm the army to a large extent.
Understanding of the nature of the invader, which is probably the philosophical motivations of them. So like the war of annihilation, they actually want to annihilate your entire society. That is their motive. We were behaving like an organism. From the Johars to in Rajasthan to Vidya Aranya Swami reconverting, doing a Ghar Vapsi of Hakka Bukka and establishing the Vijayanagar Empire, or the Khalsas, all of this. And later, if you see the RSS, if you like, right? All of these movements coming up and becoming nationwide movements, integrating people across communities, across castes. He is saying that we are behaving like an organism. Now, very, very powerful insight, and not as a disintegrated provincial society, as, for example, Rabindranath Tagore and in his quotes, as I quoted earlier, said. Namaste, everyone. Shankar Bharadwaj Khandavali and Anuradha Goyal together. We are going to be talking about a host of issues, but mostly starting from where we left off in a conversation earlier with Shankarji, which was largely around the intensity of invasions that we faced, and was almost like Shankar takes a stand that it's an asymmetric war on us, and we perhaps belittle ourselves way too much than we should. That's probably the essence of where Shankar's position is. And in my conversations, chats with Anuradha, both of these people who I really admire, and so there was a different perspective, which is a very common narrative around that there's been a lot of treachery and deceit among Hindus, infighting, which has led to our downfall. So that is a subject we're going to sort of visit. And like always, I will keep asking my questions, sometimes very naive, to both of these learned speakers. This is how I learn, and hopefully you all, the audience listening to this video, will learn as well. Please leave us your comments, leave us your questions. I will pick them up and maybe come back to both of them and ask the same questions. Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Anuradha, for joining me. So let's get started. So I'm going to get started with this tweet series from Savitri Mumukshu, who I follow and just admire her research on history. So yesterday she tweeted on Rabindranath Tagore, writing that whenever a Muslim called upon the Muslim society, he never faced any resistance. He called in the name of one God, Allahu Akbar. On the other hand, when we call, come on Hindus, who will respond? He says, we the Hindus are divided in numerous small communities, many barriers, provincialism. Who will respond, overcoming all these obstacles? We suffered from many dangers, but we could never be united. And then he sort of goes on to lament, if you like, that as long as you don't purify the soul, which grows only thorny shrubs, you cannot expect any fruit. He says this in context of perhaps Kshatriya Dharma of Hindus coming to defend the civilization and all. So this, Anuradha, feeds into the conversation around treachery and deceit. But perhaps you want to start with a comment on Rabindranath Tagore, as we were discussing.
I think he had very clearly said that somewhere, I don't know where, but I remember reading somewhere, he and many other scholars of his time have said that, Muslims identify with the Islam as the first identity, and any other identity comes later. Unfortunately, I'm going to quote from somebody you may not like to listen. Amartya Sen has a book called Identity and Violence. And that's where I understood how identities work. So we all have these multiple identities, and at some point in time, one identity becomes dominant. And if that identity uh, becomes dominant and comes in conflict, that causes the conflict. So, for example, right now, if I bring in something which brings in the gender identity between you and me, then this whole conversation will, that will take the forefront. That conflict will take the forefront, and everything else that we agree upon will take the back seat. So it is probably said many times, but my point has always been that, and my problem with Hindus is that we are so unrooted, we are so cut off from our roots that we do not know how to grow with the roots. So any small hawa ka jhonka comes and we just sway with that jhonka. Somebody comes and tells us, your this ritual is wrong, we just sway with that. Somebody comes and tells us something, and I was in that category. Honestly, I was pretty much there about 5-10 years back. If somebody questioned something, today when I'm reading scriptures, and I'm, to whatever extent I'm rooted, people cannot sway me. In fact, if they come and argue with me, they might get swayed by what I say, depending on how rooted and where they are. So my problem is that we have no strong identity holding us together. What do you mean you are a Hindu?
So that would be right now, right? But when we are talking about sort of invasions coming in, say 800, 900 years ago, I mean, we would have been a very rooted civilization, at least at that time.
We think so. We were obviously not this unrooted. But if I refer to a book called Somnath by Acharya Chatur Sen, where he's recreated a fictionalized version of the whole invasions of Muhammad Ghori, and the 17th one where he actually brought down the Somnath temple. And if you see how he entered from the northwest frontiers and how he kind of made his way through the whole, imagine where he was coming from and where is Somnath. So he traces each and every kingdom which he took along, and how many people did he really bring along with him? A handful of people came with him. Where did he recruit people from? Where did he get his armies from? He got it everything from here. So he made us actually fight against ourselves in a way. And if you see, the deceit started at that time. If we were not united, or if people were looking for a short-term gain over a long-term view of the things, so short-sightedness. There is an episode, if I remember correctly, of the king who was around Pushkar and Ajmer, what we call now Ajmer. It was called Ajay Meru then, named after a king called Ajay Meru. So it was a big deceit. It was a big deceit episode that happened. And the Pushkar remained. Somehow Pushkar survived, and Pushkar continues to be a stronghold, Tirthan. But Ajmer got, renamed as Ajmer, and, it became whatever it is. So I can't say that they were rooted. Then also there were problems. That's why a handful of people could come and do what they did.
So, and yeah, this is exactly the popular narrative that we know of.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, okay, fictional accounts can be written either way if you want to put it either in the side of defeat or victory. But if you just go by...
Yeah, Shankarji, I just want to add one more small thing, and this is what the author says, and I kind of agree with. He says very clearly that, Shankar doesn't need a temple at Somnath to live. We need him to, we as his devotees need a temple to him in that, all that glory. The destruction of temple is an indicator of our faith going down, our being not so rooted and not so strong about our faith. And I kind of agree with it based on a lot of my own life experiences, which I'll share.
So, yeah, so this is the popular, and this is what we have grown up with. So the question is how much we have reviewed this and rebuilt our own narrative, and how much it aligns with the reality. Now, has it been that a handful of people came and overpowered us? We being numerous but divided?
Yes.
Or was it actually different? Have we actually estimated the amount of intensity of attack that happened? How many invasions have happened? How many? And what is the resource base of the invaders?
Mm-hmm.
One small article I had quoted last time was where I had put the maps of the caliphate in 700, in 1500, in 1700, 1750. And what is the size of the Hindu kingdoms at that time? So by the time we started facing invasions, the resource base of the invaders was quite huge. It's not as if they came with a paltry army and they could overpower a huge army. Number two, the number of invasions.
So Anuradha, this is the article that Shankarji was talking about. That just from a scale, the Umayyad Caliphate in the 700 CE, and just the size of resources and the scale versus India, it was probably much larger. Maybe from a geographic territory, but also perhaps mostly from number of resources that they had, and the fact that they've been an invading army constantly.
Right.
And here is the number of invasions. This was picked up from another blog. And this counts the number of invasions North India faced before finally in 1206 it was North India was finally lost.
Right.
So Shankar, over to you.
Yeah, so if we just put the resource bases and the sizes of empire, I think we were actually facing a much bigger power at every point of time. Whether it was in 700 or 1500, and definitely 1750 when Marathas were there, they were facing the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, along with the Sultanates. So the magnitude of what they had faced, we greatly undermine when we say that few people could defeat bigger armies on the Hindu side. So it was not like that. Basically, the second part is even if we just put a simple numeric win-loss ratio, Hindu warriors come out in flying colors. This applies to the Marathas, the Ahoms, the Bundels, the Rajputs, the Khalsas, everybody. So each of them have actually a better win-loss ratio than the opponent. Opponent actually had to mount 8, 10, 20 invasions before he could gain ground, which means either in terms of commitment or in terms of caliber in defending, we come out in flying colors. The problem is the cost of loss. You can win 9 wars or 9 battles. You can lose 1 battle. But that proves to be your battle of annihilation, because the loss of battle means that you have lost your ground to the enemy, where the enemy can devastate your territory, your people, your wealth, everything. So we often mix up our cost of loss with the actual losses. So the cost of loss, let us say the Panipat, whatever loss we incurred, it took several years for us to recover, for the Marathas to recover, and finally again, eventually they had overpowered British also. They won the first Anglo-Maratha war. But it has costed us. Every time there is a loss, it costs heavily. That is because we were fighting a war of annihilation. The enemy doesn't have just the intent of victory. Enemy has an intent of annihilating you and destroying you. And obviously the resource loss that comes with a loss, with a military defeat, all these things count.
That gives me another point, Shankarji. Do we miss that annihilation instinct?
That is how any civilized society lives. No civilized society believes in annihilating others.
Right.
It's not.
No, in a war.
No. So it's not a battle of annihilation. It is a war of annihilation, where you actually go out and destroy the civilians. Right? That is not something that Hindus ever believed in. Even where Hindu kings defeated other Hindu kings, they have not destroyed the women or property or the farmlands or people. So that is a difference of civilization.
No. I'm not talking about that, but I'm saying not eliminating the enemy completely when you even when you won wars, when you won battles with them. You did not annihilate the enemy. And when I say enemy, I don't mean civilians. I mean, anyway, their civilians were not here, but
uh, invasion forces work differently, right? Invasion forces work with, they have mobility usually. So it's a question of whether you have the logistics to pursue them into their lands and eliminate them. That logistics often are missing on our side. It's a logistic incapability. We are simply not equipped to go into enemy territory, which is much bigger than our own territory, and pursue them. So the invasion force, was it destroyed? Yeah, it has been destroyed in many occasions, but it has also not been destroyed.
Yeah. So for example, when I look at Ghori, Muhammad Ghori, he took months together to come down every time, and there were numerous occasions where he could have been killed, not the army. And if you kill the leader, you pretty much disarm the army to a large extent. I mean, in good old days, not like today that you can replace the army chief and carry on just like that. In good old days, they were really motivated by the leader. So, and there were numerous occasions where Ghori could have been killed, but he managed to escape. And that's why he could keep rebuilding his army.
So, Ghori case, we can't say that with certainty because our past records usually are a combination of hagiography and facts. So we can't say how many exactly times he came in and how many times when people say he was forgiven. Let us say Krishna had forgiven Jarasandha. Magadha was the biggest army. It is very unlikely to forgive somebody who would have retreated. Obviously, they had to retreat to Dwarka. So it's a question of how you put the narrative. It's not really a question of is it a military fact? I can't say that with certainty that we had the logistics and then Ghori was let to live. I just can't be certain about that fact of the past.
Okay. So all the things, I mean, for example, I'm reading this blog right now. I pulled it up while. So you're saying that the first invasion where he came from what is now Afghanistan, Pakistan to the kingdom of Jaipala, and then Bhatia, then Multan, all of these possibly are questionable. Is that what you're saying? Or the wars happened?
The battles would have happened.
Okay.
But the result of battle, how it is put. Was he retreating and we allowed him to retreat? Did we have the logistics to pursue him into territories where he was invading? That's the main question.
No, Shankarji, I think we are seeing it from today's lens. In the old battles, the king was the most protected guy because if you kill him, you've kind of killed the battle. I mean, that's how the game of chess is also designed. Once the king is gone, the battle is gone. And that's why they used to imprison kings. So if we see it from today's lens, then we can talk about all these things. But by going by all possible accounts, I cannot imagine that he came from the northwest frontier, traveled all through Rajasthan, Gujarat, came down to the coast of Somnath, where Somnath is, and there were no occasions to kill him without our people being involved. And there are accounts of his infiltrating in a very soft way through his Sufi saints and people who were out there as his, if we can say, a kind of spy network. So all that played an act, and he actually, I mean, they engaged in. If I go strictly by what I have read in these books, they engaged in all kinds of things like obliging the right hand of a king, of a powerful king, so that when the time comes to kill, this guy will not kill him. He'll do everything else but not kill him. So they engaged in all kinds of things. But somewhere they also caught hold of our weak spots very well. And also, let's not give away the fact that in our land we have a position of strength. An invading army will never have a position of strength in our land.
Not necessarily. The raiding force and invasion force usually has the advantage of flight. So it's a question of whether the defending territories have both the advantage of numbers as well as mobility. It's not easy to contain an invasion force. I'm not talking of from today's perspective. Do we actually have sufficient military understanding of the situation is the main question. So commander is eliminated. That is true. If the commander is removed, the invasion force suffers and it scatters and all that. But that has not happened. It's not easy to happen. I'd like to take a contrasting example for you. Roman Empire is there. Did Roman Empire have any unity? Did it not have treachery inside? Just survey the politics of Roman Empire. There is so much of infighting, so much of treachery, backstabbing, everything was there. Still, they could sustain, because it's not because of any of these factors. What matters end of the day, are you an expanding force or a contracting force? If you are defending your own territory from outsiders, you are in a very different position in military and political sense and economic sense. And if you are an expanding force, you are in a very different position. You have the advantage of going after the enemy, and infighting would automatically operate differently. Infighting in a defending force would be seen the way we are currently seeing. One guy has backstabbed and we lost the war, all these things. In an expanding force, infighting would result in people getting divided and going and attacking different targets on the opponent side. So we'll need to understand this difference. The Roman force was an attacking and expanding force. Similarly, the Islamic force was also an attacking and expanding force. Same with the Mongols. This is not an ideology difference exactly. This is how the situation played out at that time. Today, we look back, and even if we apply it to today's situation, the infighting would play in a damaging way, as we keep reading into our infighting or caste fighting or the kings not being united, all these things. This will start operating very differently once we take an expanding mindset instead of a contracting mindset. If we see ourselves as a shrinking society, a shrinking geography, the infighting will all be faced in waves. The moment we start seeing this is the time to look out and expand, all this infighting would start playing out very differently. It would be damaging externally, not internally. The question is whether the Hindus at that time, when they were facing these invasions, were they in a position to expand or contract? So on the West, there was, given the size of the empires that were on the attacking mode, there was no way we could expand from there on the West. So eastwards, we actually expanded and increased our resource base. That gave us a cushion to fight back. We eventually built empires that are big enough and removed the invaders from our territory. So this is how I would see it in a big picture. We can always dig down into specific instances. Are there traitors? Yeah, there are traitors in Rome also. There are traitors in Islamic society also. There are traitors everywhere. That is human nature. Question is, how is it dealt?
See, some amount of traitors will always be there. I mean, they've been around from the time of Ramayana. Vibhishan was a traitor in a way, right? But the point is the quantum of those traitors. It's like you can have a little bit of poison and nothing will happen to your body, but beyond a point, it starts hurting you. So the point is, what is the quantum of traitors and what incentive do traitors have to continue to be traitors?
Yeah, so that depends on your current phase. Are you expanding or contracting? That's exactly what I'm saying. In an expanding phase, infighting and all this backstabbing would operate very differently. Its consequences would be very different. In a defending mode, it would operate very differently. In a defending mode, one guy gives the secret, then your fort collapses. In an expanding mode, that is not required. You have infinite resources. There is the whole world you can go and plunder. So the same phenomenon has different results in different situations. But did we not have unity? I don't think that's the historic reality. I mean, people did come together. Big federations were created. Confederacies were created. Obviously, we didn't have a single political union. That was never the case. And in spite of not having that, people did come together. So it was goodness of people against lack of a system, rather than goodness of system and people being bad.
Okay.
One factor we historically ignore is, can we name any other society where a movement like Gorak or the Nagas or today's Hindutvadi, RSS, VHP, the whole bandwagon of, how come this kind of huge organizations or movements come up, grow to such a size and deliver such output only in this society, if this society does not have unity? It's a paradox, right? I mean, it's not possible that society is not inherently having that ability or the will to generate, and still these things get generated. It's not obviously the wisdom of one Gorakhnath or one Khalsa Guru. It's basically because society is like that. It has been producing people like this, leaders like this, and organizations like this. We have greatly undermined the greatness of Hindu society when we say that we lack this or lack that. Now, why do we need to do this? It's not a question of self-pride or anything. If we do not accurately apprise our society, we will not learn the lessons that our ancestors have taught us. The lesson that Vidyaranya has for us, the lesson that the Khalsas had for us. Today we are not implementing any of those because we have, in our own ego, actually undermined their own wisdom. If we have not drawn upon their wisdom, obviously we cannot use that to build what is required today and to face our future. So the primary lesson they gave for us, the weapon they gave to us in facing the Abrahamics is, they have understood the nature of the enemy. The main instrument of the enemy is fear or terror. Once you have defeated that one thing, the fear, you have defeated the enemy. And they did demonstrate it, whether it is Banda Bairagi or the Marathas or the Khalsas, anybody. They have seen fear eye to eye, which today's leadership or society is unable to do. It's not because society has become suddenly wimpy. Society has been as valorous today as it was earlier. But the leadership has failed to draw upon this lesson that our people gave us. And that is why we are not actually seeing any aggressive leadership today. We are only seeing very passive and defensive leadership. And that makes all the difference. A good leadership would lead you to victory. So the lack of, where we are actually failing, we'll need to identify and pinpoint that so that we can make correction there. So far, it's been wrong diagnosis, putting blame on the caste or the lack of unity or this or that. I don't think that is accurate at all.
So I would say, Shankarji, there has to be a balance of both. You cannot just blame it on the invaders, because invaders' goal and aim is to invade. They are very clear in that. They have no ambiguity there. They are there to loot your wealth. They are there to take your territory. So they are there and they will keep coming. If 1,000 years back there was this thing, today, in a way, we're becoming an American colony. Not politically, but in a lot of ways. Look at our culture; we're just imitating them blindly. When I look at, I used to live and work in Bangalore. If you look at the electronic city in Bangalore, what is it? It looks like some suburb of US in a city where the weather is so damn beautiful, and you create those glass and steel buildings and make them sit in air conditioned 24/7. So these things will keep coming, and for me, unless I'm rooted in my own knowledge, whatever knowledge we have right from the days of the rishis till the knowledge that you are talking about from Khalsas and Marathas for the Kshatriyas, people will keep swaying us, whether culturally, socially, economically, politically, through armies of whatever. This age has different sort of armies. So whether it's COVID, whatever, they will keep invading us till we are rooted in our own knowledge. And that gap I am failing to figure out how do we address, including the gap that you are talking about. This situation will not change. We cannot undo the invaders. They will be there.
Understanding of the nature of the invader, which is probably the philosophical motivations of them. So like the war of annihilation, they actually want to annihilate your entire society. That is their motive. In our earlier conversations, I mean, for example, this has been a thought process among us Hindus, that we didn't understand the nature of Islam. That is why we let Prithviraj Chauhan, and what Sanjeev Sanyal calls the Prithviraj Chauhan syndrome, is about letting go of the enemy in honor of dharma.
Right.
Shankar actually challenges that whole notion. Okay, saying that perhaps firstly it could be hagiographic accounts. It's all made up stories and all of that from the side of the invader. Okay, that's probably not our stories also, that Prithviraj Chauhan and his honor or whatever let him go. We don't know the military circumstances of that time. Okay, and what were the reasons, whether he retreated, he ran away, or what was the true story, we perhaps don't know. Okay, don't know enough. That is one point. The second point he makes is that we actually understood the nature of the enemy very well. And a very, very powerful and beautiful point he made in our earlier conversations, which really gave me goosebumps, was that we were behaving like an organism. From the Johars to in Rajasthan to Vidya Aranya Swami reconverting, doing a Ghar Vapsi of Hakka Bukka and establishing the Vijayanagar Empire, or the Khalsas, all of this. And later, if you see the RSS, if you like, right? All of these movements coming up and becoming nationwide movements, integrating people across communities, across castes. He is saying that we are behaving like an organism. A very, very powerful insight. And not as a disintegrated provincial society, as, for example, Rabindranath Tagore and in his quotes, as I quoted earlier, said.
I recently read a very, very powerful book on Goa's history. It's again a recreation of the history, but it's a recreation based on all the records, because incidentally there are records available of these since the Portuguese times. But it's the first book that I have read that's written from the perspective of the people who got persecuted and people who had to leave and settle all across the coast. And there were enough attempts to reconvert the people. There were people who had to get converted. The author has very beautifully put that if I was a Hindu Brahmin, especially a Brahmin, I had two choices. Either I keep my land and let go of my dharma, or I keep my dharma and let go of my land. So land and dharma both could not be. And half the people chose this and half the people chose this. People even tried to strategize, saying that I will keep half the family will keep the land and half the family will move out, so that half of them. People tried all kinds of things. But eventually, whenever, and today we look at it as one stroke of history, but it is a long struggle of hundreds of years and in between there are moments where we were strong, and in between there were moments when they were strong, but eventually they were the rulers. So whenever whenever our strength was on top and we had the occasion to kind of undo things, according to this author, what people failed were, dharma gurus, they refused reconversion blatantly. They just said, no, once you're out, you're out. We are not going to reconvert you.
Which is a point I brought up with Shankar on my conversation with Shankaracharya of Puri. I had written a letter to him requesting that please start a Ghar Vapsi movement.
Right.
He thanked me really.
And these are people who, to begin with, they didn't like it. The conversion doesn't happen in a snap. And so there were people who would outwardly take a Christian name and, and they'll still keep Shivalinga in the basement and keep worshipping it, or, find out ways to, kind of continue with the hope that as soon as they can, they will go back to this thing. But they didn't get anything. They did not get any support from Vijayanagar. And this is the time of the most powerful of those Krishna Deva Raya times. They didn't get any support from him in terms of saving. And if these two entities had acted at that point in time, probably the history of this region would be very, very different. Today, even despite Goa being a Hindu majority state, it's such a huge perception of it still being a Portuguese colony and a complete Christian state. So there are these things that we need to look at, not so much to document, but to learn and see that are we repeating the same things again.
What if is a very difficult thing to analyze when we don't have full facts. Again, let us say we know certain regions were conquered, there was certain level of conversion, but we eventually had Hindu empires which we did not sufficiently do the reconversion. Did they work on it? We do have data that they did. The
Right.
Devala Smriti is there. The Marathas also did some reconversion. Vijayanagara also did. Obviously, the kings themselves were reconverted from after they became state. So, how much time it takes, or what is the proportion of effort you would place onto those things? What is the leisure they got? Let us say, take the Maratha. Today's Hindutva movement and the polity is just a legacy of Marathas, if we see. And the Marathas basically believed in expanding the political power. Did they actually have the leisure? Did they look inwards to the society to bring the required social transformations? I don't think they either had that vision or the wherewithal to do any such thing. Maybe.
I mean, one hear anecdotes about Shivaji Maharaj doing some reconversions and beheading some pastors who refused to convert back to Hinduism in Goa. So I don't know, how do you put these together?
All that happened at the same time. The whole society was not reconverted. Obviously, it's not going to happen in a day.
Yeah, and even Maharaja Ranjit Singh. I mean, right from Kabul, he had a huge Sikh empire, and I read a post lamenting why did he not reconvert everybody to Sikhism, for example. Why did he not convert all the Muslims and made them Sikhs? So
it's like saying, why did Modi not change the constitution in 10 years? I mean, it's not going to happen.
But that's not an equivalence, no, Shankar, because Modi is under this constitution which he bows to, unfortunately. But Maharaja Ranjit Singh was a monarch.
What I meant was, if he has to change it, there has to be a framework that needs to evolve, and that homework is a decade's effort. It's not going to happen in changing.
But 30-40 years of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's rule on Kabul.
Same. So that's what. Did we actually estimate the magnitude of effort and time it takes, and did they have the wherewithal to do all that?
So they didn't have the vision, you're saying, or they didn't have the framework or understanding that why this reconversion
needs to happen? They were not in a situation, they just didn't have that leisure to do that kind of activity. Inner transformation was not possible when you are facing external threat. I mean, remember what Tilak also said, social transformation or anything has to happen after you gain independence. We did exactly the reverse. We tried to transform ourselves under the British, and this is how we ended up. So when this whole social justice, all that came up, and the demands were made to, for the equality, all these things, Tilak said, he was a visionary. He said, unless you have full independence, you cannot do proper transformation or reforms. Whatever we do under the influence of the outsider is going to be damaging to us, not constructive for us.
I want to add, I'm reading a beautiful book called Akat Kahani Prem Ki by Purushottam Agarwal. It's on Kabir's time, and it's on Kabir's poetry and his times. And he's and I mean, this is not really directly related to what we are talking, but he beautifully brings out the fact that so-called modernism was already happening in India during the times of Bhakti poets, and he says there was, for example, there was Mirabai. She was a queen and she could dance on the streets and still be revered. She could go to, Rai Das, who's so-called a chamar, and ask him to be her guru. There was Kabir, who, now people try to paint him like he was a Hindu-Muslim unity guy.
All this is not some modern transformation outsiders brought in. My point is, this has been the spirit of our society always. Nobody questioned the Varna of Vidura or anybody. And in 20th and 19th centuries also, nobody questioned the Varna of any Aurobindo or anybody.
Absolutely.
So it's basically great people were always honored in our society.
Absolutely.
Not these barriers are all, the way we apply the Western prism to understand Hindu society.
Yeah.
It's not the nature of our society to,
Yeah, so the Renaissance there started in 17th century, and they said your Renaissance so-called can happen only after our Renaissance can happen. And in the 19th, 20th century, sometime we started believing that.
So,
and we are still believing it. That belief is getting strengthened far more now than it was even 50 years ago.
Yes. Because now we have fully applied the British prism. Whether we talk of Marathas or the Vijayanagara, did they actually have that leisure or the situation where they could actually bring such transformations that we seek today? Today we are in an independent country. We should be able to bring transformation, but we have seen how many constraints we have even in an independent country. So is it even realistic to expect them to undo 20% of population's religion in a century that they had ruled? I don't see that to be even reasonable as an expectation.
We are right now, post-independence, bound by the ideas of secularism and whatever they.
In contrast, they also had the political will that has been demonstrated clearly from the king's side.
They had the political will to create a political territory.
Not just that, the reconversions also show that they had the other will also. But the question is, are they positioned for that or not?
I think what Rahul is trying to say is that, there is a warrior class which will work on changing the political boundaries and political equations. But the social thing has to come down to a different section of society which should work parallelly on it. You can't give, there may be a political protection that a king or the ruler gives to do that, but the actual work has to be done by a different section of society.
Once again, going back to Hindvi Swaraj under Shivaji Maharaj's rule, right? Which maybe after him really dissolved or weakened and all, but under him, could so to Anuradha's point, did the Sadhu Samaj, did the Brahmin Samaj come up? Like they refused to reconvert. Now these kind of things, we talked about sheets of the Sadhu Samaj. Why does this have to come up? Aren't we to blame for this really? Or can we say that the Marathas did not have the vision or the wherewithal to actually take on those things? Is it their vision? Is everything outsourced to Shivaji Maharaj to think about? What about the Sadhu Samaj or the Brahmin Samaj around him that time?
So that's what, like Vidyaranya Swami, they also did their part. That is how the whole Bhakti thing came up, and that is how the force of conversions was resisted. Now the question is, it's
so
a question.
You're saying that Bhakti, like right now, I remember one of the conversations earlier where you said actually Bhakti is also a response to an understanding of Islam, the invading force, and it's actually a response to prevent, to cocoon our society, not cocoon, but protect our society.
Definitely it is. And regaining society is a question of expanding. Were we in a mindset of expanding or not is the main question. It goes back to whether it is politically or in a religious sense. Are we as a society shrinking in our mind or expanding in our mind? If we think that this is timeless society, I can expand anytime. There were some phases of such expansion that came. And there were some decent number of reconversions. Obviously, reconversions won't be advertised in a time when the outsider was aggressive. But I can't say that it did not happen. Are there questions of acceptance or rejection? There are questions. Those questions will come up today also. We need to be judicious about what is done and what is not done. What should be done, what should not be done.
Maybe we'll talk about this. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So those questions are different actually. I can't put them side by side with whether things happen or do we have the mindset or not. In a time when your acharyas were getting killed, actually you lost several Vedasakhas themselves. Even the preservers who were chanting were eliminated, right? So The Kondavidu, actually, they had to go back. Kondavidu, Maratha, Vijayanagar, all three, if you see the empires, they had moved out from plains, very fertile regions in their territories, into regions protected by the hills. And there, it was very costly for them to maintain a civilization, bring up a civilization. They did a miracle to bring up a civilization in such mountainous terrain. If you go to Hampi or any Maratha place, you will realize this. They had built such a grand civilization there. They created pockets where the Veda Shakhas were protected. Today we have the knowledge because they did all that. So it's a question of their sense of proportion. Is that important? Is this important? There, the Dharmacharyas would anyway, any day, single day, make a very easy decision. Between permanent and temporary, choose the permanent to be preserved. Because 100 years later, your fortune will change. A more powerful fellow will come. He can use the permanent principle to generate a new temporary thing. He can generate 100 reactions. But never lose the permanent. So they had invested so much in protection of permanent. Today, are we doing that is the question. Or are we corroding the permanent because we want to improve the temporary? So are we actually thinking in the dharmic lines that the Acharyas taught us?
So I like that question, Shankarji, that it also comes with the commitment. The rootedness also comes with the. So I'll take an example of a well-rooted tree, no matter how it can withstand any amount of or any velocity of wind. But if your roots are not strong, you're going to sway with whatever wind comes. And these all innovations and everything are winds, in my opinion. And we have to grow our roots to withstand the winds which will keep coming. Winds will not stop. You can't stop the winds.
They were constantly investing in the permanent. Their energies were focused to retain that, which is where the Shakhas, for example, the Ved Shakhas in Vijayanagar Empire came up and all of that. We are not investing in the permanent at this point in time. We are only going about a narrative, say, of, for example, we must do Ghar Vapsi, we must claim back Akhand Bharat, and all of this business is probably going on. But there is no investment in who we are.
Absolutely. If we are rooted enough, if we are strong enough, Ghar Vapsi will happen on its own. The people who convert for money today will convert for power, will convert for other things tomorrow. They convert, they're like Thali ka bangan, they will go wherever the power goes. So the idea is you have to strengthen yourself and people will follow. It's like Kabir ka doha, Kabir man nirmal bhaya jaise Ganga neer, pache pache har fire kehat Kabir Kabir. You strengthen yourself, the world will come after you. What does a sportsman do? What does a Lata Mangeshkar do? Has she done anything for anybody else? She's just improved her own craft to a level that the world runs after her. I'm just giving a very crude example.
We are trying to capture power, then everything will fall in place. That's what they are saying. Now, is that power gained in the right way to serve the right cause is the question.
So, political power is one thing. Again, politicians also, they will run after us when we have the strength. Why are minorities... In my 40 plus years of existence, no politician has ever come to me asking for vote. Why? Because they know they can't sway my vote.
Or they know your numbers are so small, it doesn't matter to them. They are going after
influences, or my influence is so small, So if I have the strength, if I have that strength, if I have a strength in a particular, let's say a small constituency, there is no way these why are political parties taking people from each other? Why is BJP taking from Congress? Because they have influence. What I'm saying is you have to strengthen yourself with knowledge, with whatever it needs to be, and you will start attracting people.
I want to bring up one quick point on our core of the conversation about whether we were invading, whether we were going into others' territory. I think while defining the deshas, Shankar specifically, right? He talks about, yes, it was Mugendraji in one of his videos. He talks about a desha which is, I don't remember the name. It is southern Iran. And he says that is the outer boundary of what was basically Greater India, if you like. So, right? And that place is mentioned that if you go there, you will have to do paschatap. Was this one of the reason in memory that continued much later, that we will not go invade outside, we will not go invade, or do you think that has an impact on what we...
No. So from what I know of the past, we did expand westwards also. We did go up to Khorasan. We know stories where people had actually gone there, tried to convert established kingdoms there. It's not as if it has to be always a political expansion. People went and civilized the lands, the societies there. And it happened eastwards, southwards also. From the Islamic invasions, we just didn't have the wherewithal to go westwards. Eastwards, we could go even under the duress of invasions, 15th, 16th centuries, we were expanding downwards, south and east. So lack of expansion mindset is definitely not the reason we can attribute to. And there were people going, time to time, the rules keep changing. There are certain situations when you don't want to expand because you can't sustain the core, you can't expand. So again, this reabsorption of outer sheets into the core and revitalizing the society, which we can do only when we have a full self-governing model. Once that happens, you can again talk of this expansion and all this. I mean, all these excuses, we can dig down and see they did not do because of this or that. Maybe they just didn't have that ability to do it. They were not in a situation to do, and several reasons could be given, because every layman cannot be educated. So you will put in some rules. But those rules wouldn't have been definitely foolish. They would have been well thought through. A very wise set of rules is what I would say.
So I also want to say, Rahul, this shloka exists in almost every Puran of, south of Himalayas and north of this and east-west, which is a boundary which clearly says the progeny of Bharata. It doesn't say you can't go outside or inside. It just says this is the land of Bharata. And that Bhudevi example that he gave, Bhudevi means earth. It doesn't mean Bharat. It very clearly means the earth, and it has to do with the evolution cycle of the solar system and the earth. Bhudevi cannot mean a small part of earth. It means the whole of earth. We treat her as Devi and the others don't. That's a different thing. So, these are popular narratives that have been built without really reading it in the context. In fact, the place where, and I'm incidentally reading Brahman Puran, which is all about the evolution and the cycles of the solar system, probably the most scientific of the Puranas. And this description of Bharata is a part of the larger description of the whole of Earth. It does talk about the deshas that exist in all the four directions of the Meru Parvat. Out of that, one is Bharata. It actually has it's actually top down. It talks about Africa, it talks about America, it even gives the Varna. It tells you that people who live in Africa are dark complexioned and people who live in this desha are very Shweta Varna. So it has a complete description. People pick up one and then they keep thinking that the others are not defined. It doesn't talk about political boundaries at all. This is actually a very geographic description of the land. Very, very geographic and geographic and everything else which is apolitical.
Yeah, that I agree. I think we have that two different geographic representations. One is the geocultural, where you have the desha, then the khanda, varsha, then you go all up to the dvipa. So Saptadvipa Vasundhara. Right. So this is that is where that Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, all that comes.
Right.
So that we have that universal perspective. At the same time, we have a different geopolitical representation of the Rajas and the Samrajyas, all these things.
Right.
So they exist side by side. I mean, this is exactly the difference we have from the nation-state model, where the geopolitical and geocultural coincide in a nation-state.
Right.
So people could go travel all these things, but there were certain conditions, certain situations where civilizations on the other lands had gotten to such a situation where it no more became feasible for dharmiks to travel. that could have been definitely a reason. And probably one visionary who could actually go and bring a transformation, they did travel from time to time.
I did a video on the travels in ancient India. And there were 3 or 4 primary reasons for which people traveled. One was, and the biggest reason for travel used to be trade. So it's possible that people traveled only when there was a reason to trade. Today, if you analyze the air traffic, we have a huge traffic between India and US, India and Europe. We don't have as much between India and certain other parts of the world because we are not trading as much with them. An East India Company came here to trade to begin with. Trade was one of the biggest reasons. Second was war. And the third was, of course, leisure travel kind of thing. Education was a big reason to travel, which continues to be a big reason to travel even today. So these were the primary things for which people travel. So it's possible that...
Yeah, and we being a first world country at that time, all such travel for study and all these things were inwards, not outwards.
Inwards, yes. If we look at Chinese travelers and if we look at all the travelers, we actually don't have, in fact, I've been searching for accounts of Indians who traveled outside and documented. I can't find anybody. I find so many accounts of travelers who came into India and wrote about India or took things back and wrote in their countries. I don't find anything apart from British era and later.
Pratakadhas or the Puranic stories, we do find a lot of narratives where the so-and-so trader has gone out to this country, that Dvipa, all these things. So allegories are there where we know that people from here, though this was the hub, probably they did travel, not just they did trade, and they also, seers had also gone actually. They had brought a lot of transformation in the other societies that we know, where they tried to bring some dharmic spirit into the civilizations outside this land.
If you have examples, please share. I will be happy to explore them
yes.
further. Yeah, because I don't know of any travelers per se who traveled and wrote about it in the pre-British era.
We don't know of travelers.
Even in the British era, they came and wrote. We never really went out, apart from Vivekananda's travels, which are very well documented.
Yeah, this last century, we had seen people go out purely with the dharmic spirit, trying to awaken that spirit in those lands. But my understanding is that has happened in the past. We don't have very much that practice of documenting those things.
We didn't document the way British document. Yes, that was not the way, but we had our own ways of documenting.
No, we do have our documentation, which is the Aitihasic model. We don't have this chronological linear model.
Yeah,
right,
so we don't have that kind. We don't have that the dates and wars kind of things. We write it in a storytelling mode. We have our ways. We have our canvases are different. We painted. We wove it. We wove the stories. We sculpted. Everything. I have one blog on one Ajanta painting, where one Ajanta painting contains content worth a book in it, if you want to look at it. So we had our ways, but if you see it from a British lens, yes, we didn't document the way Britishers do.
Obviously, we don't know today. That means we don't have the record of whoever traveled outside and what he noted from outside and documented here as a book. So we don't have such book.
Right.
But we know people did go.
Right.
And we know people did bring transformation in the other societies. I mean, not just like Bodhidharma, there were others also westwards who had traveled.
I am unable to find. So, for example, something like Shankar Digvijay, something that's so well documented.
No, because those will be documented within our territory.
Right.
Usually we are, pagans are usually, they respect their geography. So we write our record within our geography. So people who went from here and established things there in different lands, they would have documented in their own societies to suit them. For instance, in the Khorasan regions or whatever. So I don't see...
I tried finding. I couldn't find outside India also. I tried finding. If you come across anything, please share.
This is Naveen Banerjee, if you just hear them.
In between Ganga and Yamuna, we have Kurus, and across Ganga, you have Panchalas. You can see the sentences quoted below, and this is just a what we call Ding Matram. Okay. and then we have Surunjay to the north and Matsya to the south. Then we have northern Janapadas, Gandhar, Kekai, Madra, and we have eastern Janapadas, Kosal, Vidya, Kashi, and then we have a very interesting sentence here. We can see the Bhallavi Gatha there, quoted in the so-called Bodha and Dharma Sutra. People say it is a late Vedic text, but nothing doing. It is actually part and parcel of the same Vedic ritualistic manual. What it says is, you can read it there. It is Gatva Punastomena Ejata Sarva Prusthayava. It is actually in some portion, some prescription of a ritual. If you go somewhere, what is it? Sindhu Sauvira Anartha. Sindhu Sauvira Saurashtra Anartha Avanti Vidarbha Magadha Anga. What are they? These are the Sankirana Yonaya. These are the boundary Janapadas of Aryavarta. Very interesting. And then there is a further sentence saying Arattan. Arattan Karaskaran Pundran Sauviran Bangan Kalingan Gatva Punastomena Yajeta. You need to do Prayaschitta if you go to Aratta. What is this Aratta? You will again wonder. This Aratta does not find any mention in later Indian literature. But it is the southwest Iran. It is that portion which has been talked by Sumerian epics in 3000 BC. That is Aratta. And it is talked by these Vedic texts. As a Janapada, you should not go. If you go there, you do penance. And then we are talking about Karaskara, most probably Kasgar. Of course. Now, if we map those things that we saw in this thing, very interesting. You see the boundary Janapadas? They are really on the boundary of this Aryavarta. And all the outside Janapadas, they are really outside this.
That was the point I was trying to make.
No, but I'll with whatever little knowledge I have, let me tell you, we have Shruti text and Smriti text. So this is potentially coming from a Smriti text, which means it was relevant for a certain time. If you remember, Rahul, in mid 1980s, when a Punjab problem was at its peak, and if you spoke to a South Indian to come to Punjab, they would say the same thing. You know, or in our lifetimes, going to Kashmir is saying the same thing. It's almost like you'll be inviting death if you go to those places. So these are temporal things. I don't think they were meant to be true forever. It potentially comes from a Smriti text. Smriti text has a timestamp. It is relevant for a certain period of time.
Bodhana, this is part of Kalpa, which is technically not the Shruti, but yeah, it's part. Vedanga is part of that corpus. Yeah. The point is not that. I think it's important to understand this. We have that Aryavarta, we have a Bharatakhanda. These are not synonymous, but these are all important in their own place. Bharatavarsha is more a geocultural, that whole thing. Aryavarta is where Manu says also that this is the region where people are most likely to be practicing dharma. Whenever things go down, it is from here that you are going to get a fillip back for revival. Other lands, they are not going to be able to sustain. And you need to keep exporting dharma outside. I mean, it's not sustainable outside this territory. It is not sustainable. It can, from time to time, it will get revitalized. It will rise and fall outside the Aryavarta, but it's not sustainable. From that perspective, we'll need to understand this whole Prayaschitta thing. It's not that you can't go there, live there. You can't conquer there. People did conquer Aratta at some point in the past. Ashwamedhas also have happened where the extension to that part has happened. It needs to be slightly put in perspective rather than, so I don't think, it's not a question of applicability. It is applicable, but its spirit is different.
Yes. It didn't mean that if you step into that territory, you have to do Prayaschitta.
It does good. But its context is different.
Context is different.
So, to complete that, Aryavarta is there. Then Aryavarta is part of Bharata, Bharatakhanda or Bharatavarsha. Then you have the Dakshinapatha. Then you have Ganasthanas, the peripheral regions. Then you have Upaganasthanas. So in a geopolitical and cultural setup, if we understand these sheets, right, again, politically, we know that they have seen certain region as the core where the dharma will always either survive or revive continuously. Outside these, it will not survive. Ganasthanas is where it is still, you always need some backing from within the mainland to sustain it. The Upagana is where you'll need to, it's still a little more to the periphery.
Buffer zone kind of thing.
Yeah, outside that, anyway, you don't have that control. So this is how we should see it.
So then now it seems to have shifted southwards.
I mean, look at the how similar Afghan sounds with Upagana.
Yeah, it was Afghanistan. It was. Its etymology is that.
Oh, wow.
It was Afghanistan. I have a long list, Rahul. I'll give you someday.
Very
Of,
good. We should
etymology.
Next talk about the Deshas and the Ganas and Upaganas and bring it to our audience. So very good. Thank you very much. We'll end this conversation with this piece. And it's been lovely talking to both of you. Hopefully we'll continue these conversations. Thank you very much.